So we are live. It's Tuesday, February 11th. This is the Senate Education Committee. We just broke from a joint hearing with the House Education Committee, and we're now at 2 o'clock or a couple minutes after, moving to the issue of instructional scale, and we have representative from the Superintendent's Association and superintendent from the school district. So if you could, we'll introduce ourselves first, and then we'll let you introduce yourself. So we'll start with Senator Hinsdale.
Hey, Senator Keisha Hinsdale from Chittenden County.
Hello again, Nader Hashim, William County.
Dave Wade, serving Rutland County. Senator Longar to the Bennington Senate District. Missing because we had Longar missing. So,
Steve Heffernan, Madison County.
so introduce yourselves.
I'm Bill Kimball. I'm the superintendent of schools for Maple Run, which is St. Albans City, St. Albans Town, and Fairfield. Prior to that, I'll get a little bit more as we get into it. But I've been a superintendent for the past 13 years in 2 different districts and been an administrator in 4 different supervisory districts in my career here. Been educated for about 30 years.
And it's nice to see you all again. Chelsea Myers. I am the executive director of the Vermont Superintendents Association. So thanks for having us. We wanted to come here and talk to you about instructional scale today. We think any big part of education reform should be related to the scale and the delivery model of the way that we deliver education in Vermont. In fact, we feel like it's essential to make decisions related to the delivery model and not just finance. If we try to do the same thing with less money, we're only going to hurt kids. And so this brief is in response to one of the major pillars that have been discussed around scale, and it looks into some of the research related to scale on 3 different domains, one being district size, one being school size, and one being class size. And what I would like to emphasize right up front is that some of these recommendations are based on research, but don't give the full consideration of the fact that many of them would require significant infrastructure investment and a really good hard look at geographic necessity in terms of how we deliver education because of some of our more rural areas in the state. So the size and scale of educational structures, class size, student to teacher ratios, administrative capacity, school district size, and school size are often considered influential factors in shaping quality of instruction and overall student outcomes. However, research on their direct impact remains mixed. Their effectiveness is very deeply intertwined with factors such as teacher quality, resource availability, and the unique needs of local communities. That first one, teacher quality, is most correlated with student outcomes. In rural areas, for example, geographic necessity adds another layer of complexity, as sparsely populated regions often face challenges such as small enrollments, long transportation distances, and limited access to specialized staff or resources. Balancing educational quality with efficiency and affordability requires careful consideration of research and contextual factors. So the brief that you all have access to now will consider how instructional scale can help to address some of the needs of Vermont, and also infuses some practical knowledge about the history of Vermont and some of the other things that we've learned along the way. And Bill has a lot of experience in implementing things like changes to class size policy and looking at small schools. And so I'm going to ask him to kind of interject and talk about the more practical elements when I deliver some of the research. And so let's start with district size and governance, a huge component that's been talked about so far in education reform. Research on district size generally paints a picture of benefits on a U-shaped curve. Studies indicate that smaller distance districts typically face higher per pupil costs due to inefficiencies, such as higher administrative costs and underutilized facilities. According to the Vermont State Education Profile, supervisory districts or unions with less than 1,050 long-term average daily membership spent 26,000, and those with greater than 2,000 spent 21,000. Please note that that does not consider weights or equalization. However, very large districts may encounter diseconomies of scale, where the benefits of increased size are outweighed by bureaucratic inefficiencies and challenges in maintaining educational quality. A study by Duncombe and Yinger found that consolidating very small districts can reduce per pupil costs. Their research suggests that cost savings are most significant when very small districts, those fewer than 300 to 500 students, consolidate, but these savings diminish for larger district mergers. Another study by the same authors reviewed the literature on economies of size. So they took a lot of the aggregate of all the research studies around size in education and concluded that cost savings may be substantial when small districts combine, but there is little evidence of sizable cost savings in large district consolidations. They suggest that the optimal district size for minimizing cost per pupil while maintaining educational quality appears to be in the 2,000 to 4,000 student range. They also find that diseconomies of scale may begin for districts above 15,000, and another study in Kansas stated that that diseconomy of scale may emerge at 10,000 students.
Just you're going really fast.
Okay.
And so I think we're having a hard time, may have a hard time keeping up with where you are.
Sure.
So a little slower.
Okay.
And go back again and remind us when you say they, who was that?
Oh, the researchers that published the research article.
And who are they?
This is
What is their name?
Their last name is Duncombe and Yinger, and they're all included in the citation list. So if you wanted to go and look into those studies, I highly recommend the one that is the aggregate of a lot of different studies, because they analyzed a bunch of different ones and kind of put the recommendations based on many different research studies.
So, so they assimilated other studies. Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, one of the studies I referenced, they did their own study. And then the other one I referenced, they collected a bunch of studies and analyzed them across different modalities.
So what we like to do in the committees is have challenging perspectives as well. Are there studies that show just the opposite of what you're articulating? You know what I mean? You can grab one, hold it up as a shining star, but there could be another that says just the opposite.
And that's why I like the studies that pull in a lot of different studies.
I'm asking if there's counterpoint.
Not that I found in relation to these particular points, but I have to make a full disclaimer, like people who do this research would spend years putting together. And so I did my best to compile it, but full disclaimer, I might have missed some for sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So
Is this, 2 to the 4,000 students for Vermont, that's big, but for other, they're talking even, this isn't just for rural states. This is for
Yeah.
like New York City and that's what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, most of the studies or several of the studies are related to those that actually would push towards policy consolidation for a policy decision. And so naturally, they'll be studying those areas that would be pushing for greater consolidation. So that might naturally exclude some of the urban environments as a result of it just not being a policy consideration in those areas.
Yeah, I'm just surprised how low the number is. I have to say, just quite surprised.
Yeah, and in comparison, the number used in the Ficus and Auden report is 3,900, so it falls within that range as well.
the point then, if I understood what you said, is that when the district begins to get larger than that, it becomes bureaucratic.
Yeah, like you have to,
Therefore, you lose efficiency. Is that
that's the findings from the research, or things like added transportation costs, depending on how you configure your school districts. But yes, most of it has to do with once you get past a certain number of the inefficiencies of like being so big and having to build out a central office that actually loses efficiency over time. And I don't know, Bill probably.
Yeah, I have colleagues that have worked in Hartford, Boston, Worcester, and those are districts of Hartford's around 35,000 students. And so what happens is you have to build a lot of associate superintendents and deputies. And then what you have to build in is management teams that support the schools because of the federal laws and the state laws that come down that happen from support to central office. A good example in Vermont is our HHB, our hazing, harassment, and bullying law. So I'm engaged right now as a superintendent, not because I'm a superintendent, but because I have to take a centralized role to help support an appeal of that law. And so what they usually have to do is in the urban districts is form a triumvirate that's usually around a principal supervisor, a special ed director, and a human resource person. And they usually have somewhere between 8 and 12 schools that they support. So that triumvirate comes together, and those are from different departments and then they support, and they're meeting with principals and heads and schools, and school sizes anywhere from 400 to a couple of thousand students. So they have to provide that. There's that back end support that principals and assistant principals need and schools need.
So it would just seem at that point that larger numbers would make it easier, but, you know, and I'm not one way or the other on this. It just, you know, that usually when you have more, you still got 1 or 2 people doing that job, but then. And
No, you got to, because of the amount of work that happens, that support for those schools, once you get above 10 to 12 schools for that, those folks supporting the school, whether it's a principal, supervisor, special ed director, or an HR, you've got human resource issues, or you've got student issues that the student support, the student special education person supporting, and you've got the principal supervisor who's there trying to coordinate all the school improvement work, supporting the principal in school improvement and growing that principal at the same time, along with other parent needs that might come up or child needs that would be in those areas.
I would just, I mean, in Vermont, we so often have the conversation about micro schools and what's too small. I mean, my lens coming into this is growing up in a school district that had more students than there are people in the state of Vermont. Not a good idea. You know, I just think if we're looking at best practices and we get to shape this upward, we might as well figure out what a good upper limit is.
you seem well educated though.
So, and I want to make a distinction too. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I want to make the distinction too, is that there's a difference in the research when you're looking at when do diseconomies of scale, so the efficiency piece emerge, but when also do the quality pieces suffer. So there's 2 different pieces that we're talking about here. And what that aggregate study looked at was both of those. Like if we maintain education quality, where would we put district size? So there are 2 pieces, right? If we were just focused on efficiency, that number might be bigger. But if we're focusing on efficiency with quality, the number is not as high as where they find just solely the isolated variable of diseconomies of scale.
Was there a number for both together? Is that the 4,000?
That's the 2,000 to 4,000 in that study.
Which one of these studies are we talking about? Did you cite of the event?
Yeah.
You talk about
So
the aggregate.
in the end of the document, you'll find it's actually the first one, revisiting economies of size in American education. Are we any closer to consensus?
So, okay.
And I mean, in full transparency, researchers will suggest, and those other states that have looked at some of the same exact research, like North Carolina pulled a lot of these same studies out, and it's not a huge body of research, like in full transparency, but this is what I found through the research that I found, and it was very similar to what other policy folks in North Carolina had also found. So, yeah. Good to keep going. Great. As we learned through the implementation of Act 46, district consolidation is politically and logistically complex. Vermont school districts currently have different operating configurations related to the grade levels they do or do not operate, leading to Vermont's out-of-district tuition program. These configurations lead to greater complexity, less fiscal controls, and increased ancillary needs, such as transportation and delivery of special services. Further, the report, Vermont Education Funding System Explained by the AOE describes some supervisory unions have more than one school board, which is a very rare structure elsewhere in the country. As someone who has worked elsewhere in the country, it is truly unique. Some supervisory unions can have between 2 to 7 school boards, depending on the number of school districts in their region, with between 10 to 78 total school board members. On average, supervisory unions have 1 board member for approximately every 75 students. Though school board members are effectively volunteers, this large and multifaceted governance structure often requires significant administrative time and resources to support, including multiple board meetings a month for central office staff and considerable resources to support budgeting across multiple school districts. Time and resources that could be allocated to instructional leadership and other functions to support education quality. As a comparison, according to the New Hampshire School Boards Association, New Hampshire has approximately 900 school board members as well, serving about double the amount of students that we have here in Vermont. Yeah.
Just since we're reading and, questions are coming up for me as I follow along.
Mhm.
As a superintendent, I just imagine it makes life really difficult to
Yeah.
answer to that many people and takes you away from kids.
I think one of the reasons Chelsea and I were talking about this, and she knows I've been doing this in Maple Run, but I have a breadth of experience. I've worked for a supervisory union that had 1,000 students in it with 7 different school boards that was in the Northeast Kingdom. I now work for Maple Run where we have 10 board members. We're serving 2,700 students in 5 schools. And that includes the technical center. I'm going to give you, and I was a superintendent for Washington Central right here outside, it surrounds Montpelier. U32 is known as, a lot of people know it as U32. And now up at Maple Run. And when I was at U32, we wanted to put in an alternative school to serve students because we could see it was a better financial outcome first to have our own alternative school instead of paying for them to go out for therapeutic and behavioral needs. And so it took us about 6 months to work with all the boards to get that decision through. This past June, we did an analysis of how much we've been paying out to therapeutic and behavioral schools and how many students we had on wait lists that were in our middle schools. We've already done this for the high school, not one day. But U32 was for the high school. So we need something for 5 through 8. And we have 3 schools that are pre-K through 8. And so we were looking at probably, and I don't remember the figures, so I won't quote them, but we had an exorbitant amount of wait lists or students that are already outplaced. And we were looking at about 25 students that had severe needs. In 2 meetings with our board, I was able to show them the financial model and how we could build it. We had it approved in June. And just 2 weeks ago, we launched that school. It took us 6 months to hire the people that we needed to do it. It took longer than we wanted. But then we were able to put that decision through, already bring back 2 students from outside therapeutic schools. And we plan to bring another 4 back at the summertime. It was just not individually a good reason to pull them out right now. And at 13 students, we break even with the cost for tuition amount, and we can hold 20 to 22 students in this therapeutic setting that we've created ourselves. But the board was able to see that and able to make it faster because of the size of the district. At 2,700, there are things we can do because of economies of scale that can benefit kids as well as cut the costs for taxpayers. And so we've done that in other areas too. And it's that flexibility that comes with size that isn't there with the small sizes.
So U32 that has a,
If U32 is where I was, and it was done for the high school. Yeah.
yes, okay, is it at the high school?
Yeah, it's right outside the high school. It's on the same campus.
And the one you just did was for,
Maple Run,
Okay.
where I'm currently superintendent. I've been there for 6 years. It was 2 years as an assistant superintendent in between both superintendencies. And we just did that at Maple Run.
and that had less school boards to do.
And 1 school board, 10 members, 2 meetings. First meeting we came, and that's what the way I work with my board chair is if we have something that we'd like approved by the board, we have 1 meeting where we discuss it and bring it through, and we let people have 2 weeks to kind of sit with it, unless it's something that's pretty, what I would call rote that the board's used to doing. And then the next meeting would go for approval. And we brought, they were a lot of time, and they came back with the members came back with some excellent questions. Some that were financial based, some that were student outcome based.
Actually, where was Maple Run?
Maple Run is in St. Albans City,
St. Albans.
St. Albans Town and Fairfield.
Yeah, okay,
And how many students?
2,700 students.
okay.
And we have schools we'll talk about schools in a minute, but I just want you to have a little bit more context of, we have our smallest pre-K 8 is 250 students. Before working at Maple Run, outside of U32 high school, for my career, that would have been the largest middle or elementary school I'd ever worked with for in the state of Vermont. I've been in Vermont for almost 30 years now as an educator. And so our other pre-K 8s have close to 675 at the city school, 725 at the town school, and our high school is 915. And so when changes occur, and our board has said for us to tighten up our costs, we've been able to do that through attrition because we have enough movement of staff, because we have so many staff members. It allows you to be more flexible and still keep highly qualified staff in the jobs in which they're doing. And so we're not having to move them around a lot because of the district size.
So where are you on this?
We're just finishing up district size.
Okay.
And so I can just summarize that our policy recommendations are to, in the district quality standards, set a minimum district size of between 2,000 and 4,000. So stressing that that's the minimum district size between 2,000 and 4,000, somewhere in there. And to require the reconfiguration of supervisory duties into school districts. And so with that, we'll move to school size.
Before you do.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Being that you put a lot of thought into this, have you give us the map how you think it should be broken down?
Broken down, like
Sure.
drawn.
Yeah, school sizes and things like that, it's a lot of information you've given us, and I would say here's what we're thinking.
Yeah, so like, you mean,
Like
if
a
I were
map.
to look at a map, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think, first, the SU to SD would bring us to 56, districts. And if we were looking into,
But you haven't broke it down so we can see it on a map.
not in this paper.
Okay.
What's saying SU, so supervisory unions to school districts,
Right, so that's that board governance piece that we're
Mhm.
thinking about,
and that would bring it down to,
not that part.
oh, I was like,
No.
that's still a lot.
No,
So
so then setting the minimum and
Yeah.
district quality standards, and I do think that when you get into school size as well, it has to be wrapped up in whatever you all decide to do from a policy perspective on
Mhm.
construction aid, and if there is a way to incentivize the reconfiguration of buildings. I will say, I think, and Bill can corroborate this or not, but I hear from superintendents and even school boards as well, that they have tried mergers, and there's a lot of current existing barriers to mergers right
Mhm.
now.
Yeah.
And they're the remnant of a very detailed law of Act 46. And I think that some of the natural movement towards configuration that would have been community driven has been inhibited by some of those barriers. But
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think that if there were any school or district consolidation, that leaving it to the districts to do, we would have the same results we did in 46. And so I would urge, and I would be so bold to say that, and I've said this in other avenues, that I think there needs to be a commission that's at the state level that does it. And I know in one of the House bills that's in there to have a commission, because it just cannot be done. There's too much political angst, and having been through that, the emotions that come up with either school reconfiguration or district reconfiguration tear our communities apart. And I watched that happen on my tenure at Washington Central. And I just think and I had a board chair that was the chair of my first 2 years leading, and 46 had just been adopted. And he said, as he was unfortunately passing away, but he said, the worst thing we did was leave this up to the districts, and he was against 46, but he could see what it was going to do to the communities. We'll tear our communities apart again. So if we leave it up to them.
Yep, I have a question if I can on your report. So page 3, you kind of summarize with policy recommendations. And your recommendation is the minimum be 2,000 to 4,000, but doesn't speak of a maximum. Although, there are words before that, but you didn't put a maximum. Why is that?
I think in Vermont, we trend towards the minimums, and
Are you willing at some point to offer what you think is a maximum?
I would at this point in
Just
time
give it
work towards not exceeding the diseconomies of scale found in Kansas, for example, which was 10,000. But again, I don't think I think we really need to be considering both efficiency and quality on this. And so, yeah.
There's no question. I'm just wondering why it seems like you left out the maximum kind of on purpose, but that's right in the heart of where we are right now in this conversation. I'm wondering, so you're saying verbally 10,000 is your?
Based on, we have an operating environment where I would have to go back to my board to get a concrete recommendation, but according to the research, yeah, at this time, say from an efficiency standpoint, that's where I would lean towards.
So we will see when we look at that one, in particular, you pointed to, that's where it discusses the sort of inefficiency of scale begins to emerge when you get to 10,000.
10,000 to 15,000 is where the research suggests. But I also want to point, I think the geographic span in which we're considering also really matters, right? Like if you have captured 10,000 kids in half of Vermont, it's a different story than what some of the research in other states would suggest. And so it's not always an apples to apples comparison, which some of you have pointed out in some of your research can only take us so far, in my opinion. So it's just a starting place.
That's helpful. Okay. So
One of the most compelling measurements I saw in whatever district configuration we create is relative property wealth. So we didn't hear that they affirmatively chose 5 districts because it was 2-to-1 property wealth distribution as opposed to 11-to-1 in our current configuration. But I'm just looking for, it's like redistricting, which is our census-based population process. We need to keep looking at the modeling and the numbers, but I would imagine that, or I would love to hear if property wealth equalization is something that you think is an important value with me.
I think that's really contingent on what direction you all take in education, finance, and funding. So I don't know that I'm equipped to kind of relate it to what you all are talking about at this moment. I will say, historically, the 5 districts that they are proposing are based on our superintendent regions. Those superintendent regions were created just to gather superintendents for monthly meetings. They are not grounded in anything related to education quality.
They're like commuter distances.
It was really just can we get people together from regions to come in and talk about things with one another. So that really is what they were designed for.
Yeah, I'm on one of the sprint teams for governance of the VSA rep. And so I just learned last Friday about exactly what you said, Senator, about the grand list to 8 a.m. and ask for a lot more information to educate myself. So I don't feel out of place, but I would totally agree with Chelsea that I think it really depends on the funding. And if we're going to use if we're going to look to split the funding in the support of education from the state to the district, in this foundation formula, then the grand list has a lot to equate in that. If it's coming under our current model where the money all flows through the state for the funding, then I wonder why the grand list is so important. And so I think that I think that's a fiscal piece to be asking with what's the formula we're looking
I think the grand list becomes important if we make it possible for districts to raise money above the block grant.
Yeah.
That's where it begins to get complicated.
Yeah.
As it relates to, if we were to go to a block grant model, then the district law wouldn't actually matter that much if that's all it was.
Right.
But it's that extra fun with it.
You might want to look at, I'm not an expert to say this, but you might want to look at what Massachusetts is going through right now. under their Prop 2.5. Where they have a combination formula and they're having some issues right now. I hear that from my colleagues who are
Wow.
superintendents in Massachusetts, and there's some real angst going between the urban districts and the suburban and rural districts.
They have a half proposal.
It's called Proposal 2.5, Prop 2.5. It happened about 10 years ago that we did the funding in Massachusetts. I look to Massachusetts a lot for both educational, so quality and financial. But I'm not an expert to testify.
What expert you have time to get through this?
Sure. So the next section is around school size, and I really like this quote. I think it exemplifies the complexity of school size, and it says the concept of school size is somewhat nebulous. It actually represents an amalgam of effects rather than just a raw number or a single effect. Size is important because it catalyzes conditions in terms of school climate, curricular offerings, student participation in extracurricular activities, student self-concept and self-esteem, teacher-student relationships, homeschool relationships, and student opportunities to learn and grow. All of these have important roles to play in determining student outcomes. So research on optimal school size suggests a range that balances educational effectiveness with cost efficiency. Again, sometimes those can be in conflict with one another. In their review of 57 studies, Lakewood and Jancy found an optimal size of 500 students for elementary schools and 1,000 for secondary schools. They advise reducing these numbers to 300 and 600 schools with high proportions of disadvantaged students. Lee and Smith found that students learned more in middle-sized secondary schools, 600 to 900 students, than in smaller or larger high schools.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to give you some of my experience. I've served schools as small as 60 students where there's a teacher teaching multiple grades, and I'm not even into high schools yet, but up to 725 at St. Albans Town Educational Center. What I find about the school size is it's a combination of grade ranges served and number of classrooms. And we have our Fairfield Center School is 250 students. It's our most efficient and has best outcomes. But there's one teacher per grade level. So if we have a bubble, it makes it hard efficiency. It's like if we get over 28 kids, we have a couple grades that are running in that area, and that makes it very efficient. But we have to start thinking about getting 2 teachers for that grade. So one of the things that I would add to this from my experience of serving schools, when schools have at least 2 teachers, but best 4 teachers per grade, you can really get some teaming and teachers using the collaboration to really serve the students the best. And also at that same time, we have this happening in city school right now. We have a grade level that for pre-K2, we want to keep it at 4 teachers. It's around 62 kids. But as soon as they become 4th graders next year, we're going to go to 3 teachers. And we probably won't have to reduce a teacher because of our attrition I spoke of earlier, but we'll be able to make those flexible changes. So that school size, while important, is really important for the ancillary support professionals, OTs, PTs, unified arts teachers. But it's also the number of grades the number of classrooms per grade that are in there. And that's been really my experience. And I've watched it really opens up the opportunities for students and the ability to have a more personalized education, because you can have different schools within a school. And whether we're at primary, elementary, all the way up to a high school. And I think my kids, I love the education they received. They were at People's Academy with about 300 students. But I look at the opportunities at People's Academy and the opportunities at BFA St. Albans, which I serve at 900, it's night and day. And it's really the closest thing to a comprehensive high school in my career, where we have a tech center where the past 3 years, either our valedictorian or salutatorian or both last year, were students in the technical center taking tech classes at the same time taking AP classes in high school. So that school size, it's secondary, and I'm a former physics chem teacher. I was a high school teacher science, there's a little bit of math as well, but the opportunities that we can provide, and it's so easy for us when we get 15 to 20 kids and say, hey, we'd like to go do this for our English class. And if they can find a teacher that said, yeah, sure, I'll be like, we can try to figure that out. And it's a lot easier than when you have such small high schools.
I just want to note that a lot of the quotes in that are over 20 years old. Not that they're not relevant, but that's 20 years ago. And things have definitely changed in 20 years. As you well know.
But I would say the school sizes, it hasn't, it's actually what I've seen we're able to build we're able to buy educational environments within the bigger schools. And that we can personalize more to students that way in a more cost effective way.
But not go over a certain amount, right?
Right. Yeah.
There's that sweet spot.
There's that sweet spot, just like districts. Yep.
Getting back to the sweet spot.
Yeah.
You give a minimum, but you don't give a maximum here as well. Yeah. I'm wondering if you're willing to offer your maximum school size, granted with all the nuances of geography and such, just if the research didn't lead you to,
I'd have to get back to you.
that's where
I
we are.
also think that
Trying to figure out that window.
the infrastructure that we currently have doesn't even beg that question currently. There aren't many high schools, I think that could, and I could be wrong on this, maybe. Bill,
I know. We're
that could fit
I'm just
more
asking.
people, more kids than what we would be talking about.
I know PFA St. Albans were the 6th largest high school in the state. And we're maxed for space. And we have 2 buildings that are connected by a hallway
With 900 kids.
with 900 kids. The one thing that has changed a lot, and I think you may have heard this, but what I've really noticed in my 20 years or 30 years of education is how we use our educational space for the needs of students. That has varied, and rightly so for what the student needs are. We need a lot more space than we used to. Yeah. Because for every student.
So where you're busting at the gills, we have other schools that can't,
That's right. Yeah, and the schools that I live in Woolgate, Elmore. So I know the schools that I live right next to, they're not busting at the gills. It's where the population, and in Franklin County right now, we're very stable. We're growing students. Our ADM, our average daily membership is growing each year.
you're one of the lucky ones.
Well, St. Albans has done a great job with this economic development. So good.
Yes.
Oh, I was reading thing at me.
Did you have another one? No. Okay.
So having been here for Act 46, I think the most difficult outcome from that felt like we didn't do it intentionally was to close a lot of elementary schools. So I see that you have a 300 student size for elementary schools. That is where we hear a lot of small is beautiful, don't make our kids travel. Can you talk a little bit more about how you arrived at 300 and if the superintendent's all? And that's for a district, or is it for a school?
So the ideal school sizes of 300 to 600 is based on research.
Okay, this says 300 for elementary and 600 for secondary.
Right, but you wanted to know about elementary.
So it didn't say 300 to 600 for one.
It said 300 for what we're recommending is a minimum of 300 students. And here, right, we hadn't gotten to the fact that we have $6 billion in facilities needs, right? So moving to 300 in a lot of places right now is likely not possible. So unless there was significant investment in infrastructure needs, and have had a lot of conversations with superintendents about that, they're like, yeah, great. If we had, the faith and ability, and if truly kids would be on buses for a really long time, then yes. So there's it's trying to thread the needle as you all have to grapple with as well of what can we provide that is best for kids and live within the current constructs of what we have. How can we optimize both? And so would all superintendents agree to this without infrastructure investment? No.
And would you sort of, I don't know, just to make it makes sense for Vermont. Would you include maybe like 3 to 5 year olds or pre-K programs in that number of 300?
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I'm just like, I don't know what a 300, I don't know how you model that out and how much you're paying or.
So I can give you an example.
Yeah.
In our, if we made pre-K 4, we've actually started to look at this a
Mhm.
little bit in St. Albans because we have 2 pre-Ks, one that's 725, one that's 650, and they're literally a mile and a half each other,
Mhm.
buildings,
There are how many?
a mile and a half.
But the 75,
725
725 pre-K
and
through 8.
650. I could easily make, if we said 300, I just took pre-K through 3rd grade
Mm-hmm,
in either of those buildings.
mm-hmm,
And so, one of the things we've been talking about is our pre-K, it's too much of a grade span. Should we have one building that's 5'8"? And
Right.
this has been a long time discussion in St. Albans. It's
yeah.
been going on well before I got there, and
Mhm.
it's a contentious piece. But, should we have one that's in a primary and one that's at middle school? And so but that's 4 classrooms
Mhm,
at each grade level
mhm.
with 20
Right,
students in them. I'm getting to that 300. So just trying to paint a picture for you.
Yeah.
You were asking.
right. And that would be on the on one side of the coin, if you wanted to, because Colchester was thinking about this too, I
Yep.
think, like,
Yeah.
do you make sense of a relatively, for Vermont, large population of younger kids versus do you push multiple elementary schools together to get 300 in certain places? And
In my experience from working in rural
Mhm.
Vermont and living in rural Vermont, transportation is going to become, you're going to get into looking at bus routes and how long the kids are on.
Right.
And that's going to be part of the discussion that's going
Doesn't
to
have to be.
It doesn't have to be, but it could be.
Yeah.
so you're basically saying this, 300 students in elementary schools, you'd get economies of scale, you might gain some quality, but you'd have to invest to actually
In
make
some
it work.
areas,
In some
right?
areas.
Yeah.
And I think that's like even more so. I think we had started this conversation of like, there needs to be some type of body that helps to do this, work,
Mhm.
right? Like we can't it's very hard for us to look at a map. We can do some of it and just like kind of draw things without knowing the conditions of the building in each. And the AOE has a lot of this data, but what really needs to happen is like really look in individual circumstances. But we don't have any benchmarks at all now. So like, we don't know at all what to aspire to around it. And so the concept here is that in our district quality standards, which it paints the picture of what efficient and effective delivery of education is, that in the education quality standards.
Mhm.
If we put in there like the ideal, then we have something we're working for. And then, there would likely need to be a body of people that are doing that individual work. It's very hard to just paint a magic brush
Yeah,
without understanding the exact conditions of the buildings and the commute times and those types of things.
right.
So would you're talking here about, I want to make sure you have time to get through. So we need
I
to,
think class size is important, so.
you talk about elementary schools with optimal size of around 500. And then you alluded to this because we're having the same discussion in one of my districts, other districts where I live actually, about the need for middle school versus having everything in one.
That's a.
So what you didn't talk about here, and I'm just wondering if you've done any research about how advantageous it is to have a very separate purpose, maybe purpose built, but also purposely run middle school versus having it all in one building as they used to be, always K through 8.
I'm not sure that I'm following your question, Senator.
I'm asking about whether you talked about an optimal size for about 500 for elementary, and I think that means K through 8.
I'd have to go back to look at the research.
I'm just wondering if you have anything to offer the committee about the advantages of having a separate middle school.
So I didn't bring anything. I would tell you my experience is that in a separate middle school students have different needs than elementary and high school students. So that if we have us in keeping them in the same building, there are advantages and disadvantages. Some of the advantages that I can tell you that happen in my own building is we have 7th, 8th graders. They're down mentoring kindergarten through 2nd grade students. It's beautiful to watch. But some of the disadvantages are the needs that the middle schoolers have and the needs that the elementary have are different. And so meeting those developmental needs can be a challenge. And that I believe from my experience, having that being separate physical locations is better for the children and for their education, because we're able to really focus that building's mission on working with that grade level. But that's my
okay, so my question then, well, the answer to my question, part of this, that's not something you really consider as it relates to why you're here today.
I would have to go back to the research study to see what the grade configurations were. I do know that in Picus and Auden, they do model based on having a distinct middle school.
So keep going. You gotta get through this.
Yeah. Okay, class size. And the first time I came in to talk to you all and talked about our priorities, this is one of the ones that continues to be a priority for the Superintendent's Association. It was last year when we were talking about this as well. Class size is pivotal in Vermont's education policy decisions, especially given its rural context, declining enrollment, and fiscal challenges. Vermont class sizes are already smaller than those outlined in research, and that research shows mixed results regarding the relationship between class size and student outcomes. So it provides some examples of some studies, and what we're finding now, there was a kind of a movement towards smaller class size as a big policy lever for quality. And what they're now finding is that the correlation between student outcomes and class size on its own is not as strong as they once considered it to be. In Vermont, class sizes can fall significantly below that range, limiting the breadth of instructional strategies provided, especially for students in higher grades. Very small class sizes can create challenges for instruction. They can force grade configurations that change yearly, creating an inconsistent curricular experience. It is difficult for teachers to implement varied instructional practices in very small classes, and these are instructional practices that are done in research, but not often referenced in regard to class size research. To my point, the Mass Department of Education found that reducing class sizes significantly increased costs without corresponding gains in student achievement in most cases. Relevant gains made from decreases in class size may not outweigh the benefit of investing elsewhere, like quality intervention staff, professional learning, after school program, etc., that have a greater impact on student outcomes. Currently, Vermont's policy is silent on minimum class sizes and caseloads. However, the EQS sets maximum standards. In addition, Act 153 required that each supervisory union and member district board adopt minimum and optimal average class size policies. While addressing staff to student levels more broadly is ideal, Vermont's current reality is that data reporting staffing is not clearly defined. For example, one district could report contracted services differently than another district. Reporting definitions and requirements must be consistent across school districts to equitably and fairly implement policies related to staff to student ratios that do not detract from overall education quality. However, that should not imply that policies should disproportionately impact one category of employee over another. While Picus and Auden aim to address specific staffing rules in relation to setting an adequate amount of funding, it does not specifically look at what would be required for Vermont to implement its vision for education. For example, the description of Vermont education currently defined in the revised education quality standards. What's more, it does not align with initiatives already set in law, for example, multi-tiered systems of support. That's why the Picus and Auden report can serve as a starting point for policy discussions. There are distinct adjustments that need to be made to align with the current values supported in policy and a future vision for public education in Vermont. And the recommendations related to class size for us are to require minimum average class sizes through the EQS and district board policies. So you already have a framework in law, both through the education quality standards and through the Act 153 school board policy that could be a smooth policy lever to implement minimum class sizes and not just maximum class sizes. Our recommendation for minimum class sizes is for kindergarten 12, for 1 to 5, 15, 6 to 12, 18, and then some exceptions may need to be made for specialized high school and CTE courses. The way we came to that is 45 superintendents, which you all met with the day of our all members meeting, got together and kind of hashed it out. I gave this presentation of what the research was, and they got into 4 or 5 groups and discussed it, and this is what resulted. So the second is to require the AOE to clearly define staffing reporting definitions by December 1, 2025. So that clear policy recommendations to move incrementally towards the New England staff to student ratio averages can be made in the second half of the biennium.
Only thing I would add is this is very hard for school fields to set minimum. They sit across from folks that they know they're going to be affecting their jobs. I watched my own board struggle with this fall. They never set a minimum, and I said, you've asked me for a budget, I need to know what the minimum class size you want as a board. It took 3 meetings, and I talked about how efficient my board is with other things, and this is because they were looking across to who was sitting in the audience, and the teachers knew what we were talking about. And it was tough for them.
So
They wanted to push it back to me.
So when you give a minimum, you end up combining grades. If there's a minimum, what happens in that case? Because, you know, if you only have 5 first graders and we have a minimum of 10.
And you're combining, and that's what I served in my career. There was no way that you could have them, at least the districts I serve, that they could afford to have class sizes of 5. So they had to combine 2, 3 grade level. That's why the school size is so important. That's what it is. And that makes it really hard because every teacher needs to know plus or minus 2 grade levels worth of curriculum to be able to be effective for the differentiation they have in their class. So if I'm a 3rd grade teacher, I need to go down to 1st grade, down to 5th grade. If I start having multi grades in my classroom, I'm just expanding that. And the focus on literacy and math alone, along with SEL, the amount of knowledge that a teacher needs to have. This is a whole other conversation we can get into for instructional effectiveness, but you need about a master's degree for each content area to implement the curriculum as a teacher. It's very challenging.
So, following up on what Senator Weeks has asked a couple of times, here you again, minimum. You didn't go to maximum, right?
Yeah, the maximums are set in the education quality standards. I think it would depend on who you asked as a superintendent, whether those needed to be adjusted or not. I have to go back and do a survey or something along those lines. I will say, like, we addressed minimum because we were looking at what conditions need to be set to start to move towards the scale that people are talking about. What I will say is that having conversations about closing schools or making class sizes bigger are really, really difficult. And it's one of the cost drivers related to our education system. Like, it would be remiss of us not to think, like, governance alone is not going to address the education costs that we face, right? We have to look at healthcare, infrastructure, housing, and what's in our control or what's in the control of or like within the purview of what a superintendent does is related to the number of staff that the system needs and the number of buildings that they feel it needs. And so that's the perspective that we're taking. And we know that it's super hard. We would definitely need some support for communities contending with this. We're not going to solve this simply by moving to bigger governance structures. We have to also look at schools and the scale in classrooms themselves too.
Thank you. So I think I saw you starting to turn it up again. Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah.
Well, first, I just want to say for the record, I do consider myself a pretty good product of my public school. But in much larger districts like that, the wealthier the community, the more they cut off their their schools from the larger system and get their own superintendent. And, that was my experience in a more well-to-do part of Los Angeles. So, they either remove their kids from the public schools or they try to separate themselves, and they end up with districts of about 10 to 15,000, even in major cities. So I just think if we're trying to give our kids middle class opportunities, we have to remember that most people who can make that choice don't put their kids in gigantic school districts. I sit here and feel like we're finally getting to hear from the people who are doing the work. And I'm curious, my cluster of questions is like, how many superintendents are there? I'm trying to meet with my own, but I'm in Chittenden County, so I can't meet with every superintendent one-on-one. This is obviously somewhat static. If we don't have a quorum of the committee, are there opportunities for individual leaders in the legislature to meet with your superintendents and like hear more? Because I'm struggling with, having the, someone relatively new to our state be like the person we are hearing from day in and day out. That's not a xenophobic statement, hopefully, as someone from away, but like, we are just getting to talk to the people who have lived this reality and have tried to make it work for years.
Yes, reach out to me. I'm happy to connect you. And to answer your question, we have 56 superintendents. 4 of them are tech district superintendents. So we have 52 non-tech districts.
Okay.
And 52 non.
And you all have committees that came up with this?
This was a product of board work and a lot of surveys and all members meetings. It's an amalgamation of a lot of things, and it's only focused on the scale piece of things. There's so much other consideration.
Yeah, like, do you want to answer to just a board of 5 people that represent 15 to 35,000 students alone, not to mention population?
Personally,
Yeah.
I am not speaking for anyone else.
Yes.
Bill Kimball.
Yeah.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's the scale that Vermont has been built on, but that's our problem that we sit in right now financially. So I think we have to find something in between. I did my doctoral research on superintendents and communities and how you connect with your community and work as a community-based superintendent. I try to do that in my practices right now. That what I learned in my research should suggest that that tie for rural communities is having that connection to the leadership is really, really important. And when that's gone away, there's been a huge loss of there's a loss of life that you've seen it. We've talked about that in Vermont. Our young folks are moving away, and that's Vermont, New Hampshire. My study area was Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, which has the highest concentration of people living in a rural setting of anywhere in the United States. People hear about West Virginia and Appalachia, and we have more folks living in rural settings. So that makes these challenges very unique. At the same time, I think having grown up in this state and born in this state, people like from the Rutland County, it's great to see a senator from Rutland County. That's where I grew up, and just thinking of that rural nature and that connection to our communities, to our schools. In the towns I live in, the schools are the largest employer. And where I am in Franklin County, the only larger employer than Maple Run is the hospital.
I thought you were going to say government.
Yeah, no, nope. Because I know how many people are in that across across Lake Street from me in the state office building there too. So
And
it's,
unfortunately, numbers like that make it what's happening.
yeah, I agree.
Public school hires more than anybody else. It's like, where are they generating the income?
That's pretty true for most of rural America.
Mhm.
That's not just a Vermont problem. Right.
This has been really helpful. Thoughtful testimony, and with, we're going to explore it more, obviously.
Yeah, if I could just add one last thing, that I think squeezing funding to force these decisions is gonna hurt kids. And so I think it's gonna take some really challenging discussions and conversations and decisions from you all. And we thank you for taking this up. It's A lot of hard work.
So, thank you. Yeah, so we have a quick break, and I think we have all our others coming on 3:50, playing on 3:15, right? In person or?
1% and 1 remote.